Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the center. Welcome to this presentation by Austin Haney. I'm so glad you're here because I'm sure he put some valuable time into getting this ready for us. And I, for one, am excited to see this presentation. I think that we're all fortunate to have history presented to us. Some of this, many of us didn't even know. So thank you for that, Austin. Sam, I'll work with y'all as long as I don't have to stand next to you in a picture. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to turn this over to Sam and Austin. Enjoy your evening. There's lots of goodies at the table. Welcome to the Chinook Senior Center.
Thank you so much, Ginger, for kicking off the evening. Good evening to you all. It's so good to see such a crowd out for this special event. This is the second speaker event in Blaine County Museum's 2023 Off-Season Speaker Series. I'm Samantha French, Director of Blaine County Museums, and I'll be introducing tonight's speaker, Austin Haney. I also want to thank our wonderful host, Ginger Hansen and the Chinook Senior Center, who graciously allow us to use this wonderful venue. Ginger prepares refreshments and does a great deal to help spread the word about this program, which is very important, and get lots of people in here. So we can't thank her enough. None of this would be possible without her help. Many of you may already know tonight's speaker, as Austin has been the seasonal ranger at Bear Paw Battlefield south of town for 3 summers now. He is also a familiar face at the museum and a new employee of ours. This year, the National Park Service awarded the museum a grant to hire Austin as an education and interpretation specialist. He'll be helping us add to our Bear Paw exhibit, assisting with programming and leading school tours in the spring. Last month, photographer Mark Viteris shared his black and white images of the landscapes that border Montana and Canada, while intertwining historical narratives about these unique borderlands. He challenged us to consider the significance of the place we call home today. Tonight, Austin's presentation, Iron Dreams, Montana and the Pacific Railroad Surveys of 1853, will deepen our understanding of the history of Montana's High Line and beyond. The Stevens expedition was just one of 5 survey parties sent into the American West in 1853, but it was by far the largest and most ambitious of them all. Tasked with finding and mapping the best routes for the country's first ever Transcontinental Railroad, it would be the most substantial government-sanctioned exploration of the interior U.S. since the days of Lewis and Clark. While often forgotten and overlooked today, the Stevens expedition fundamentally altered the Northwest and continues to affect the lives of Montanans, even in 2023. Austin is a longtime researcher and reenactor specializing in the American and Canadian West. He graduated from the University of Montana with a BA in History in 2020. He has given historical lectures at the Montana Historical Society, Montana State Park, Fort Missoula, Wild Montana, and the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, among others. We're very lucky to have him in Chinook, so please help me welcome Austin Haney. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming out to this. There's a reason behind the title of Iron Dreams. The Transcontinental Railroad was truly a dream forged in iron. And for me, this program is very similar. I first encountered the story of the Stevens expedition several years ago, actually in this painting. It's done by a fellow by the name of John McStanley, who was along on the journey. And it depicts the expedition at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains just west of modern Great Falls. For somebody who grew up with this same view, it captivated me. And to see so many of you here tonight for this program, it's truly the realization of a historic dream that I've had for many years now. So without further ado, let us dive into the program. All right, so the United States in 1853, it's a country on the move. For 50 years now, Americans have had this relationship with the American West as we know it today. Starting with Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the Trans-Mississippi West comes into the United States' orbit, and Americans start moving west. We've got a long history of that going back almost to the founding of the original colonies on the eastern seaboard. So Going into the West, you've got a steady stream of government explorations like Lewis and Clark. Some of you might have heard of a fellow by the name of Zebulon Pike as well. But by and large, after that initial rush of exploration in 1803 through 1806, this part of the world is pretty well ignored. Most of the people coming into the West at the time, trappers, traders, missionaries, all sorts of characters, they are choosing routes much further to the south than what had originally been discovered by Lewis and Clark. A couple reasons for that, but that is for another program. But things start kicking off in the 1840s. Of course, you guys might recognize this. Does anyone have any ideas what that might be depicting? Yeah, the Oregon Trail. Some of our younger-ish folks in here might remember playing a video game by the name of that, right? So, Oregon Trail migration, this large-scale settlement of the American West starts kicking off in the 1840s. In that year, there's only estimated to be about 20,000 people living beyond the Missouri River. That's not a lot. Of course, a couple things are going on in the 1840s. The historian Bernard DeVoto calls this time, the year of decision. 1846 in particular, the United States actually seizes most of what we know today as the Southwest from Mexico. And you're actually looking at one of the few surviving images of troops actively engaged in the Mexican War. But what this does is it brings in this giant piece of territory in addition to Louisiana. And that's not the only thing. The Oregon country's finally settled. We had this joint occupation with Britain for a number of decades, but it's finally the United States' by 1846. And of course, minor 49er, right? Gold rush happens in California almost immediately in the wake of the Mexican War. And people who have already started to flood into the West via the Oregon Trail, they come in an absolute flood. To where by 1853, that 20,000 people roughly living beyond the Missouri River, you've got over 500,000 in just over a decade. There's only one problem. All these resources, all these people are still horribly disconnected from the main chunks of states in the East. At this time, it takes you at least 6 months to get to California or Oregon on the Pacific coast from the U.S. And to do that, you're going to have to either take a wagon, walk the whole way, or if you got the money, you might hop on a boat. But that's only going to save you about a month. And who knows, you might die of malaria in Panama by doing that. So you have all this land, you have all these people, you have all these resources, but there's no way you're going to be able to keep control of it if you don't have a way to connect quick enough. And in 1853, nothing is quicker than a railroad. So, according to James Denver, you might recognize that name from a certain giant city in Colorado. And he's the reason why. But James Denver, he says quite accurately, the question of a Pacific Railroad, it's no longer a question for debate. It is conceded by everyone. There's only one problem. Where do we build it? See, the United States in 1853 is not just a nation on the move. It's a nation that is quite quickly coming apart for a variety of reasons. No one can agree with the other people in the country. The North and the South are fighting over power and control based on the slavery question. Americans not getting along with each other. Not that we know anything about that in 2023, right? So the idea is the South thinks that if the North gets the eastern terminus of the railroad, they get all the power and economic control. Northerners believe that if the South gets the eastern terminus of the railroad, they get all the power and control. So enter one of the most underappreciated American presidents, He's an interesting guy, ranks consistently in the bottom 5 of American presidents. I think he deserves to be raised back to his rightful place in the pantheon of American heroes, somewhere in the bottom 6. Franklin Pierce. He's elected in 1852 essentially because he's the guy that people hate the least. The Southerners don't hate him enough to not elect him. The Northerners don't hate him enough to not elect him. He's kind of the compromise guy. But you know that old saying, when you try to please everybody, you end up pleasing nobody. And this is sadly how Franklin's administration is going to go. Again, he says in his inaugural address these very famous or infamous words, if you will. The policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. We're going to see how that goes for our friend Frank here. So, the Transcontinental Railroad is a big thing on Franklin Pierce's mind. And he's got his good friend, Jefferson Davis, over here. Boy, is that name going to sound very familiar in 8 years. He has got his friend Jefferson Davis in charge of the Pacific Railroad surveys. And of course, since no one can agree on one route for a railroad, why don't we go out and find 5 and choose the best one, right? That makes it fair. So, of course, in this era of sectional crisis, we're going to get a northern survey covering the 47th through the 49th parallels. We're going to get one central survey. We're going to get one that will survey the best route to connect Oregon and California. And then we get 2 southern surveys, because that's fair, right? Totally. Jefferson Davis is from Mississippi, so I bet you can see why there were 2 southern surveys. Again, it's all about who's going to get the added economic boost and the power from having the railroad and in your region. So enter one of the main characters in this story, a little fella by the name of Isaac Stevens. And when I say little fella, I mean little fella. I don't know if the fact that he was 5'3" played into how he was or not, but he's an interesting guy. Again, a real go-ahead man. It's not easy to define how the people of the West admire such a character. He is an enthusiastic supporter of Franklin Pierce, but he's a northerner, unlike Davis. The 2 of them do not like each other. Pierce has a very bad habit of awarding things to his buddies and supporters. And Stevens is given the cushy job of being the first governor of Washington Territory. Stevens being a go-ahead man, he has a bit of a tendency, how do I put this, of rushing into things and kind of domineering his way. There's a reason why he's called the young man in a hurry. He's so much in a hurry, in fact, that he actually starts putting together his expedition crew before Davis even officially hires him. Yeah, this is who we're dealing with. So Isaac Stevens is a man of many hats. He's the governor of Washington Territory, he's the railroad surveyor, and he's also going to be the Indian commissioner. Can we sense maybe some conflicts of interests are going to happen in the future? So, Stevens rushes ahead up here to Fort Snelling. This was actually done by an Army officer at Fort Snelling at the time. This is sort of the gateway to the Northwest. It's in the modern Twin Cities. And Stevens shows up there in May, starts prepping an expedition. Now, mind you, there's 4 other survey parties in addition to Stevens. Most of these number about 30 to 50 people. Stevens, on the other hand, hires 240. Go big or go home. That's quite accurate. And on June 6th, these guys set out into the Northwest. So most of their original route will actually take them through Well-worn Red River cart trails. You see, the Métis in the Manitoba region, they had a lot of well-established freight routes leading out of Minnesota and into the Dakota and Manitoba prairies. So really, for the first 2 months, this is sort of just the shakedown cruise. And it's one heck of a cruise. Again, almost 240 people. That's a lot. He's got with him dozens of wagons. He has dragoons serving as an escort. Just to give you an idea of how strange this would have looked, the dragoons in the 1850s, they wore uniforms that were trimmed in bright fluorescent orange. Crazy, right? But dozens of wagons, 240 people, dragoons. He's got Métis cart drivers. In addition to that, I absolutely love these images. Up at the top is actually a lithograph showing these guys going over the Dakota prairies near Devil's Lake. And then there in the bottom right corner, does anyone have any guesses what that is? Nobody. It floats. They brought along with them 2 inflatable rubber rafts. Bet you didn't know they had that in the 1850s, right? Can you just imagine the sight of 240 people with all this equipment and baggage going over the North Dakota prairies? It would have been one heck of a sight. So on their way through the Dakotas, they're kind of just getting the hang of things, and they develop a system, a pattern. About half of the expedition is going to stick with the main wagon train at any given time. That's their job. And bringing up the rear, they've got the odometer wagon. Essentially, with every turn of the wagon wheel, they're measuring the distance and they're able to calculate their mileage. But the other half of the expedition, they split up into separate parties to go off to one side or the other to further explore the region. And they're mostly on previously explored ground, previously traveled ground at this point. It's not going to be until they get beyond the Missouri Coteau, which is kind of depicted in this here. This is another Stanley image. You can see off at the end of it, one of the Red River carts with the boat, which is kind of fun. But really, it's not until they get to Fort Union where the real journey's going to begin. See, other expeditions had previously covered parts of the American Southwest and the Great Basin. This is the first time in 50 years that they've sent anybody out here to what is today Montana. So they have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of unknowns. And there's no greater gateway to the unknown in the 1850s than Fort Union. Of course, they're meeting all sorts of people beyond just Métis out there. At Fort Union, they talk with the Assiniboines and with the Crees. And kind of a cool side note here, that middle image, if you look way off on the right end, you'll see a guy with a spear on a horse. He is legitimately copying that painting of a real Assiniboine from the Fort Union area. So, little fun side note for you. So, for this point up here, everything's gone off without a hitch. They have really gotten the hang of things, and they're just about to really get into the good stuff. They're joined at Fort Union by a river party that's been surveying the Missouri River. And this is where a couple very important people who are going to figure into this story later enter the tale. Who's heard of John Mullen? Anybody? Yeah. This is where he joins this expedition. Oh, there we go. So moving out of Fort Union, they've picked up a couple very important people. You see, at this time, one of the most important people in this region, he's a guy by the name of Alexander Culbertson. And he's really important mostly because of his wife, Nadawista. She's a Blackfoot woman. And the two of them sort of function as the king and queen of the Upper Missouri at this time. If you want to go somewhere and you need help, you need resources, they are good to talk to. It also helps that they know everybody. You know, kind of like a small town, it pays to know people, right? So coming into Montana, they're following the old Fur Traders Express route that ran between Fort Benton and Fort Union. You see, at this time, steamboats still have not gotten up to Fort Benton. You're stuck hauling a keelboat upriver, loaded with thousands of pounds of freight. Not exactly what you call express transport. So this trail develops as sort of a way to get mail and news quickly between the posts. And this is what they're going to follow. You see, when I say discovery, it's got air quotes on it. They're really not discovering anything. They're following previously established routes that other people have been using for years. But what's really important is they're the ones who are writing all about it. That's the really important thing. That's how we know about it today, and it's why I can stand here and talk to you guys about it. So coming along the Fur Traders Trail, it literally parallels the Missouri all the way up to until about Glasgow, Nashua area. And then it takes a little detour following along the north bank of the Milk River. Sounds a little bit familiar to a certain highway. That's foreshadowing. So coming into the Milk River, they are entering a different world. Again, Montana, at this time in the surrounding region, it's a wonderfully diverse kaleidoscope of people and culture. At the Milk River, you're traditionally entering lands of the Gros Ventre. The Assiniboines are historically at this time located more north and east of the Milk. So heading into Gros Ventre country, they start meeting different parties of Gros Ventres. And the Stevens expedition notices that everyone's a little on edge. They're not exactly in the happiest of moods. And talking to one of the headmen that they run into, a fellow by the name of the Setting Squaw, he kind of reveals a little interesting borderline soap opera-like drama going on in Gros Ventre country. You see, the Gros Ventres have been for decades longtime allies of the Blackfoot. They're both Algonquin language speakers. They both originate from sort of the same area, and they've got a long intertwined history. All that changes over a little bit of a love triangle. Figures, right? Essentially what happens, according to the story that Stevens records, a Gros Ventre marries a Blackfoot woman. There's only one problem. There's a Blackfoot man who is very jealous, who wanted to marry that Blackfoot woman. Everything's all marital bliss until the Blackfoot man comes and decides that he is going to get rid of his rival for her affections. And so he kills him. Takes the Blackfoot woman back, and how do I put this? It's a very comical scene where effectively, I can't remember if she knees him or kicks him or what she does, but she manages to get away and warn the other Gros Ventres that there's trouble in paradise. And it sets off a near Hatfield and McCoy level feud between these two groups of folks. So much so that eventually it's going to cause the Gros Ventres to split from their old friends, the Blackfoot. Who do they turn to? The Assiniboines, their closest neighbors. Who lives just about 20 miles east here on Fort Belknap? Gros Ventres and Assiniboines. You never know where the things we know today come from. Again, it's a changing political landscape. But this is where Stevens starts getting ideas. And when Isaac Stevens gets ideas in his head, God help you. It's either going to go really, really well or it's going to fail catastrophically. And so he starts really perfecting his ideas of treaties and councils. And outside of modern Harlem, he actually meets and counsels with the Gros Ventres, convincing them, don't go to war with the Blackfoot. I've got a plan. We're going to all meet, and this is going to work out just fine. And this is actually a wonderful depiction by Mr. Stanley of the Grovant Council. And Stevens writes this wonderful passage describing what's going on. It's a very, very vivid scene. Essentially, we're talking about 2,000 or so Grovant folks with the expedition. They're visiting the camps and they're kind of seeing how everyone lives. Some of the men are trading shirts for horses. But the real special moment here is in the evening they fire off their cannon. They brought along a cannon as well, I didn't mention that. But they fire off this cannon, and as night comes, a comet shines in the sky, and the northern lights start dancing. And it's this really wonderful image of all these people from different walks of life. They're literally out in the middle of nowhere, and they're all standing together to watch these northern lights, as Stevens would say, shine in the northwestern portion of the heavens. So going through, any of you who've driven from Harlem to Chinook probably recognize a view similar to this. He sends off Mr. Stanley and a couple other gentlemen to explore the Bear Paw Mountains. They talk about it being quite easy to get through. There's only one problem. Stanley and his friends get lost. They're supposed to meet Stevens on the other side of the Bear Paw somewhere near Big Sandy, but they don't show up. A couple weeks later, they straggle into Fort Benton, and it's a very humorous tale. Effectively, they got lost, they fired all their bullets, except for one, didn't get a thing with it, and then finally they get the bright idea. They see some antelope in the distance, and they put a handkerchief on a stick, and they wave it and try and get these antelope to come closer, and by God, it worked. Don't any of you guys be getting any ideas now, okay? I don't think FWP is going to smile on using a handkerchief to bait some antelope in, right? But the goal is Fort Benton. They leave the Milk River literally right outside of modern Havre and start paralleling Big Sandy and Beaver Creek. I wonder what other form of transportation follows that same path. Foreshadowing. But they get to Fort Benton on September 1st. And again, half the images in this program are going to be Stanley. I should probably just stop mentioning it. More mentioning when it's not Stanley. But they get to Fort Benton, and it's quite interesting. Stanley has brought along a daguerreotype camera. That's another thing I didn't mention they brought. But he starts taking photographs of Blackfoot chiefs in the area that they're meeting. And it's considered to be this real holy gift that he's been given. He can capture an image. And that was something that nobody had ever seen out here before. These are the first photographs ever taken of Montana in Montana. The great tragedy is that none of them survive. Blame fires. If only fire codes were up to date 150 years ago, right? But this is sort of where things start getting complicated. Until now, everyone's kind of been in one big group, but they're waiting on news. There's a second party coming all the way from the Pacific coast. You see, there's two halves of this survey that I didn't tell you about. The western half, it's kind of your conventional 30, 40 man crew. And it's headed by a fellow by the name of George B. McClellan. Another name that's going to be very important in about 8 years. And the idea is that the western party is going to meet Stevens somewhere on the way. And they'll be able to sort of connect and finish the two routes together. See, there's been no contact yet. So Stevens decides, well, I got a lot of time to kill. We might as well let these western guys catch up, if you will. So he decides he's going to head north and go meet some more Blackfoot. He gets about 20, 30 miles north of modern Chester when a messenger barrels up from Fort Benton telling him that contact has indeed been made. And again, it's one of these picturesque moments where literally right at the Continental Divide, just on the other side of it, the two parties meet, literally almost right at the spine of the Rockies. You couldn't have timed it better if it were a movie. So, in a rush, Stevens, after getting this message, he packs all his guys up and they hightail it back down to Fort Benton. So if any of you guys, by the way, have friends in the Chester area who've got property out there, you need to tell them to get a metal detector and go looking now. Because in his rush, Stevens managed to drop his very expensive and brand new Colt pistol. So, again, if any of you guys have friends up in the Chester area, tell them to go out and look with a metal detector. They might find a piece of history. And if you do, let them take me along. So this is where things really start kicking into gear. See, it's September. Contact has been made between the two parties. Stevens figures, well, I have personally done enough. It's time to get to Washington and do my job as governor. But he wants to continue surveying. So he starts splitting up this big 240-man expedition into a bunch of small parties. Some of them are going to get sent home. Some of them are going to keep going west. And others are going to stay behind in Montana to keep up the work. And this is where our friend John Mullen steps into the picture. He's one of 4 men that he leaves behind. And he sets him kind of in a base outside of the old St. Mary's Mission, Fort Owen. It's sort of the only big trading post in the area of western Montana. It's right outside of a little town that today we call Stevensville. Wonder why we call it that. So Mr. Mullen is going to embark on a whirlwind series of adventures. Starting out, he heads down in the winter all the way up the Bitterroot, through the Big Hole Valley, and down towards the Beaverhead, eventually going as far south as Fort Hall. Coming back north, he's essentially going to follow the route of modern I-15, all the way back to Missoula and then back to his little fort in the Bitterroot Valley. He also takes time to do some trips to Fort Benton, going by a way that many of you might recognize, going up the Little Blackfoot River into the modern Helena Valley, then down the Missouri River. That didn't work out the first time, so he decides, well, let's go one more valley over, let's try the Dearborn. And essentially, he's starting to perfect what's eventually going to become a wagon road. I should mention by this point that Stevens also has the idea, from all the letters that Mullen keeps sending him from Montana all the way out to Tacoma. And Stevens is writing back to Jefferson Davis saying, hey, give me more money. We have a lot more work to do. Let's build a wagon road. He's getting ahead of himself. And Jefferson Davis effectively writes back saying, you know, stop with the ideas, man. We don't have that much money. Quit spending all of it. Some things in government never change, right? But Mullen continues anyways, regardless of lack of funds. He heads all the way up into the Kootenai country, around the western shore of Flathead Lake, and then coming back down to the Clark Fork. And along his travels, he just sees all these familiar sights. Quick plug for my alma mater, by the way. It's Brawl of the Wild weekend coming up, right? Go Grizz. We won't hold it against any of you Bobcat fans in here, that much anyways. For any of you wonderful red-blooded Grizz fans in there, you might recognize that image off to the left. Of course, it's missing its trademark M in a certain glorious stadium down at the base of that mountain, but you are indeed looking at Missoula, Montana. Mount Sentinel and the Hellgate Canyon. These are the first images a lot of people in the world get to see of the place we call home today. I think it's pretty incredible. And on the right, you'll notice that's one of the survey camps. And that big, awkward sort of square they got over the fire, anyone have any guesses what that might be? They're having a big old barbecue of elk ribs right there. You know, for a lot of reasons, I wish I could have gone with Mullen. Thank Ginger again for the food spread over there. It's not quite elk ribs, but it's pretty darn cool anyways. So along the way, this incident actually takes place behind my uncle's house. But they were coming back down the Missoula area. They're crossing the Clark Fork River, and they built some rafts. And they were very good railroad surveyors. They weren't exactly the best rafters in the world. It's amazing that none of them actually drowned. It's amazing that very few people on this entire expedition in general died. If I remember correctly, there's only one fella outside of Fort Union who actually dies. It's because, how do I put this? He accidentally shot himself with his own musket. How do you do that? But Mullen isn't the only one out there. There's a lot more people being based out of Fort Benton. They have probably the most interesting names on the entire expedition. I mean, Cuvier Grover. Guy sounds like a Muppet. Abiel Tinkham. Another goofy name. And then James Doty. So, covering all of them, Grover's kind of the easy one. He is based out of Fort Benton. He heads on a river survey all the way down to the mouth of the Milk River. And he actually complains quite a bit about the Dauphin Rapids, which are in the very southern extremity of our county. But he comes back to Fort Benton and he decides, well, let's take some dog sleds out there. It's the middle of winter, right? Gets about a week down the trail, perfect sledding weather. And then a Chinook comes. How's those dog sleds working for you, Grover? They have to effectively carry their own supplies on their back. They get up to the Cadott Pass, which is just north of modern Rogers Pass, and it starts to snow again. It's that wonderful Montana weather, making itself known even in the 1850s. But eventually he gets back to Mullen's base camp in the Bitterroot Valley. He's able to refit, and he heads on down the main trail of the Stevens expedition. Mr. Tinkham, represented by the red, I should mention Grover is the orange, Tinkham is the red, and Doty is the green. But Mr. Tinkham goes up the Missouri River, kind of following some of the routes that Mullen was, just in reverse. Gets along the main route, goes up the Bitterroot Valley, and eventually over the southern Nez Perce Trail. He also explores the Flathead Lake country, almost finding Marias Pass. Because again, one of the big questions for Stevens was, do we really want this big detour from the Milk River all the way down to Fort Benton and then across? What if we can just go straight across? That's going to make it much easier, right? He had heard of the Marias Pass. It had fallen into disuse by this point, so he's sending Doty and Tinkham out to try and find this Marias Pass. Literally, Doty and Tinkham are going to get within about 20 miles of the actual thing and not find it. Because again, Doty, he really goes crazy in terms of his explorations. He goes up the Sun River, he follows some of Mullen's route, he goes back through the Flathead and along the Rocky Mountain front. The guy just was everywhere. And he also found time to talk to the Blackfoot at the same time, so busy, busy man. But he goes as far up as Chief Mountain. He actually crosses into Canada, but he wasn't supposed to do that. But along the way, some of you who may have attended Mark's program may know this image here. This is of the Sweetgrass Hills. They actually get to see a lot of this, and it's from these experiences that, again, we have all these wonderful images of Montana that early. So all of these explorations in 1854 are sort of just filling in the canvas. Stevens has got one final thing he needs to do. He's got the routes. He's got it kind of figured out by this point. There's only one problem. There's still people living along the route, and they don't want a railroad. See, it's pretty common knowledge by this point amongst a lot of native tribes, even this far up, that when the railroads show up, all of a sudden the buffalo and the natives start disappearing. So the last thing you want in your country is a railroad. And remember when I was telling you guys about Stevens and getting ideas and whatnot? Well, he's got ideas. And they form the basis of the 1855 treaty series. And for those of you who've talked to me about bear paw stuff, you'll know that this is a very important moment in Western history. Just a little side note about this image here. This is Blackfoot warriors riding into one of the Stevens councils. So, very beautiful first-hand image. So Stevens starts out in Tacoma, Washington area. He makes a treaty with the coastal tribes in the area. And the basic idea is you're going to cede rights to most of your land in exchange for guarantees on a little chunk of it. But we will secure for you government annuities, hunting and fishing rights. We'll build schools. We'll teach you trades. We will make you like us. To Stevens, that sounds like a pretty good bargain, right? If I was one of these coastal tribes, or a Nez Perce, or a Blackfoot, I don't know if I'd really like what Stevens is talking about. So, following the coastal treaty, he's got one in June with the Nez Perce and the interior plateau tribes at Walla Walla. He's got one in July with the Salish, the Kootenai, and the Pend Oreille right outside of Missoula. You can actually still visit it. It's a state park, and it's pretty well preserved where it actually happened. That image on the far left is actually of the Missoula Area Council. The middle one is Walla Walla, and then on the right is the Blackfoot Council. And then finally, in October, he does the Blackfoot Council to sign that treaty. And along the way, he gets here in August. The boat that was supposed to bring up the annuities, the government agent, it's a little late, so he's kind of dilly-dallying in Montana. He actually comes up to the Chinook area for one final time. You see, the American Fur Trade, well, not the American Fur Trade, the American Fur Company operated a seasonal trading post in the fall and winter about 18 miles beyond the mouth of Box Elder Creek. So either 18 miles north and west of Havre, or 18 miles to the east of Havre, there's a trading post out there somewhere that we still don't know where it was. Again, if you guys know anybody with land in those areas, tell them to get a metal detector and invite me. Let's go. But I think our friend Pio Pio Mux Mux here speaks for a lot of people dealing with these treaties when he says, again, we have listened to all you have to say, and we desire you should listen when any Indian speaks. Stevens is kind of talking over them. It appears you want an answer immediately without giving us time to think. He's kind of pushing the issue. We have not seen in a true light the object of your speeches. I think you intend to win our country. You have spoken in a way partly tending to evil. Speak plain to us. Again, Stevens has a very, very bad habit of rushing into things. He thinks he's got it all figured out. The truth is, just like his benefactor Franklin Pierce, his attempts to quote-unquote help and fix things really are only going to make them worse. And while Franklin Pierce does that on a national level, Stevens does that out here the same way on a regional level. Because he is no sooner finished with the Blackfoot Treaty when there's already war in the Northwest with the Walla Walla and the Coastal Treaty folks over these exact treaties. This is actually a sketch done by one of Stevens's guys who was out on this journey. This is of the Spokane War, which took place in eastern Washington at the time. Essentially what happens is a lot of these tribes almost immediately realized, yeah, we kind of got a raw deal, because people are not following what Stevens himself had set out. There are ranchers and miners who think that, oh, they signed a treaty, it means that we can just go right on in. And I don't know about you, but I would feel pretty mad if somebody decided to move into my living room literally 5 minutes after I said, okay, I'll move out of this room. That's effectively what's happening. They're not even giving you time to adjust. And so war breaks out. Stevens himself, he rushes back to the seat of government in Tacoma. And how do I put this? Again, 5'3", he's got a bit of the Napoleon syndrome going on. The guy declares martial law, raises a private army, and starts targeting political opponents in the state of Washington. He starts butting heads with U.S. Army officers and officials, telling them, hey, Isaac, calm down, you're making things worse. And at the very end of it all, when it's becoming clear that this isn't going to go well in the aftermath, people might have some problems with the things I've done, he signs a pardon for himself. Forward-thinking guy, that Isaac Stevens, right? So I've been hinting a little bit about the fact that not only has Stevens blown things up in the Northwest, his benefactor Pierce has blown things up nationally. Again, in addition to the Pacific Railroad, he has the bright idea to listen to Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas says, oh, the issue in the West is people trying to decide if it's going to be a free state or a slave state. Well, instead of having all this controversy behind it, let's just let the people decide. Democracy in action, it's the American way. And Franklin Pierce says, you know what? That is a great idea. It's not a great idea. You get a mini civil war in Kansas. It gets so bad that the Democratic Party doesn't even nominate Franklin Pierce for a second term. They say, thanks, Frank, we've had enough. You've done enough, buddy. And of course, with all this chaos after the administration of Franklin Pierce, the last thing that anyone's going to do is figure out which one of these 5 routes is going to become the one Transcontinental Railroad. 1860, we get the election of Lincoln, Civil War erupts, and railroad is out of the picture. Mullen keeps working on the road, the wagon road, but that's all the money they're going to get. There's no way they're going to build a railroad in 1860 off of this. As for our friend Stevens here, I guess friend is a little bit of a generous word for him, but our person that we're talking about, Stevens, whereas Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the Confederacy, Stevens himself, for all of his faults, did have some decent principles. He's a staunch unionist, and he has some abolitionist tendencies. And he joins the Civil War. He becomes a general. And quick little side note, notice in every single photo of Isaac Stevens, he's always either sitting or pictured from the waist up. Yep. Can't know he's short if he's always sitting down, right? But for all of his faults, for all the issues that this guy had, I will say that he honestly goes out very heroically. It's the Battle of Chantilly. It's September 1862. His men are the last little bit of force preventing the Confederates from completely overrunning this army, and realizing that this is it. We got to stand or it's done right now. Stevens picks up a fallen flag from one of his regiments and he calls out, "Boys, follow your general." He takes 3 steps forward, instantly killed. And thus, our person that we've been talking about, his story ends. And this is kind of the low point of a railroad in Montana. Its biggest champion is gone. With the Civil War, there's no chance that you're going to get any funding or any support for it. But fear not, this is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the program either. But even though Stevens is gone and things look bleak and hopeless, a transcontinental railroad does in fact occur. They go with the neutral route. They decide to pick the Central Survey as where it's going to go. And in May of 1869, they finally drive that last golden spike. And all of a sudden, a 6-month journey turns into 6 days. That 500,000 people on the Pacific coast, you're a week away from anything that you could possibly want or possibly need. It revolutionizes the way things are done in the United States. It changes the course of the American West's history. And there's a part that Stevens and the expedition plays in that. Of course, it's going to be a little bit longer after 1869 until railroads start coming into Montana, the first being the Utah and Northern, reaches Butte in 1881. Next after that is the Northern Pacific. There had been some extra surveys done on that in the 1870s, which that's another story and a half, I'll tell you what. It involves Custer and Sitting Bull and all this crazy hullabaloo that culminates in a certain battle about little bighorns and things like that. But 1883, the Northern Pacific is going to come through sort of the southern and south central part of the state. And indeed, the track is still used. Then the next closest one to us is the Canadian Pacific, built in 1885. It parallels roughly about 75 to 100 miles north of us, going across the Canadian plains. And that leaves just the little sliver between the Northern Pacific and the Canadian Pacific to be put into use, the actual route that Isaac Stevens had surveyed in 1853. First is the Montana Central, pioneered and championed by a fellow by the name of J.J. Hill. You probably heard of him if you know your Great Northern history. Montana Central effectively follows exactly the Stevens route in 1853, leaves the Milk River at Havre and comes down towards Great Falls, which I could get into a whole mess about my feelings on J.J. Hill and Great Falls and the Montana Central, but that is for another night. And finally, the one that we probably all know, it's the Great Northern, 1893. They effectively follow the old Montana Central track, but whereas the Central diverted down towards Great Falls, the Great Northern's going to go all the way. You see, 1890, you finally have the discovery of the Marias Pass and the easiest route directly across to Puget Sound. That was sort of the missing link that Stevens and his surveyors had tried so hard to find, got so tantalizingly close, and then gave up right before they would have found it. Just goes to show, guys, persistence pays. Never give up on your dreams or your goals. Bet you didn't know we could turn failures in 1853 into inspirational speeches in 2023, right? But effectively, the Great Northern completes this iron dream that was had in the 1850s. By the time the 20th century rolls around, almost every single one of those surveys had led to railroads. There's not just one, there's multiple transcontinental railroads running across the United States, running through Canada as well. It really just completes the links between the East and the West, and it fundamentally changes the way people lived out here. Just a short example for purposes of illustrating, before the Great Northern, before the Canadian Pacific, a lot of freight was moving north-south between Fort Benton and Alberta and Saskatchewan. All of a sudden, once the railroad comes, it's cheaper to do it east-west. That's not the way things worked historically. People in southwest Montana, the cheapest way to get goods is you ship them to Salt Lake and then north. All of a sudden, with the Northern Pacific, you can ship things all the way from Chicago, St. Louis, anywhere in the eastern part of the country. And within a week, you've got it. It's Amazon before Amazon even exists. It brings convenience and speed to people who have never experienced that before. And it's just fundamentally world-changing in a lot of ways. I don't think we appreciate enough what railroads have done towards building the modern world we live in. And we wouldn't have those railroads if it wasn't for expeditions like the ones under Stevens. So this right here is sort of my own compilation of all the different places that Stevens, Mullen, Tinkham, Doty, Grover, all these different parties explored between the years of 1853 and 1855. Look at how many of those roughly correspond with modern roads. Modern railroads, too. I mean, the Great Northern Tract, people still use it. People still use elements of the Northern Pacific. And the Stevens expedition, though they didn't really discover anything, they mapped things out, they put it onto paper in a tangible way that people could finally see, from a place that wasn't here. They opened up Montana in a lot of ways to the wider world, to America at large. And today, again, I think it's important to remember those stories, because it does fundamentally shape the way we live today. I mean, that main track is the light blue. Highway 2, Highway 87, 200 to Missoula, I-90 beyond to St. Regis. That is all Stevens. That is all part of that route. Today, parts or wholes of 20 different Montana state highways, national highways, and 2 interstates follow parts of the Stevens route. I think that's pretty incredible. In trying to sum up this story, this expedition, we focus a lot on the adventure parts. I know I'm guilty of that. So apologies to anybody watching this program afterwards who thinks I didn't cover some more important things, but c'est la vie. We do things in the moment, right? But I was thinking about this story the other night. Again, this is the culmination of years of research. And there's a lot more to be done, and there's a lot more to talk about than I have time for tonight. But thinking about it, I realized this is an expedition with no monuments. We don't have a statue for anybody out of this except for Mullen and his road. But it's not quite the same. There's no scenic markers for tourists to stop at in Montana that talk about this history. And there's no trail that people from all over the country come to follow. The actual physical trail, in a lot of cases, you can't see it anymore. You can't go out into a field and see exactly the same thing that they saw in a lot of cases. There are some places, but they're few and far between. And really, it's because where so many historic routes, so many historic trails fell out of use because people found better alternatives. I mean, the Oregon Trail, there are portions of it that people will never use again, just because there were easier and better routes to go. The Lewis and Clark Trail, there's only a few sections that you can still travel easily today without having to rent a backcountry outfitter or get on a boat and disappear into the Missouri Breaks for 3 days. No, the Stevens expedition and their trail, it's still very much alive today because we're still using it. It's in the highways. It's in the railroads. Every time an Amtrak speeds by on the track, it's because of that expedition. Even you guys here, I guarantee that every single one of you here tonight used part of the Stevens route to get here. And for me, that's something worth remembering. Even with all the flaws, it's some dark history as far as the treaties go, but it still informs a lot of tribal law today. A lot of different tribes, reservations, and things like that, hunting and fishing rights are based off those set in 1855. We still live with it today. And with that, guys, I hope you've kind of gotten a sense of why this kind of stuff is important, why these stories matter. And I hope it has given you sort of an appreciation for the stories that maybe we don't think about every day, but really, really shape how we live. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam one more time and some questions. Thanks for putting up with me for the last 45 minutes.
Thank you so much, Austin. And I think that everybody here probably saw his passion come through on this topic. And Austin, I thank you very much for sharing. Really, it is a passion project for him to get to speak about this. And this is the first time he's ever spoken on this subject. This is the culmination of a lot of research for him. So I'm really grateful that he was willing to do this for us tonight. And I hope you all enjoyed that as well.
Yes.
You and I spoke earlier.
Yes.
And having grown up in that area, the Sweetgrass Hills, and you talked about the lost pistol, when do we go?
Oh, yes.
I grew up about 5 miles from what he's talking about.
You show us where the MP comes in on that.
Yes, I can. So, Northern Pacific would basically follow along that way.
Did anybody explore that?
So that Northern Pacific was left for another survey to do in the 1870s. Starting 1870, 1871, they started sending guys into the Yellowstone Basin. You see, there's a reason why Stevens was the first to come out here since Lewis and Clark. Our friends, the Blackfoot, had some things to say about that. And likewise, our friends, the Sioux and the Cheyenne, had quite a bit to say about people coming out to look at a route for the Northern Pacific. It's not going to be until after the Sioux question is decided where both the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern are going to be able to come through. So,
When did they start passenger trains?
passenger trains, almost from the start. Again, passenger travel was very, very big on all these major rail lines.
I have a
So,
letter in one of our places in Boston, and the people were from St. Louis, Missouri. And in this letter, the mom wasn't doing well, and they talked that she should, and they told them that they had to come to Helena, Montana, and take the stagecoach. And that letter was written in 1901.
yeah, there's a few places where you still have to use other transport to get to another rail line. But
They told them they had to
Yeah.
write the stagecoach. And even the price of it.
So was the Rocky Mountains, were they always aware of that would be
yes, yes. By 1853, they knew pretty darn well that the Rockies were the big issue. Lewis and Clark didn't know that, but Stevens sure did. It's why that Marias Pass is so important.
But they did the wagon wheel calculating the miles. How do they do that?
So, if you know the circumference, the distance around a wagon wheel, the odometer tells you how many clicks, how many times that wheel has gone around. Multiply that by the circumference of your circle of your wagon wheel. That tells you how far you've gone. It's a lot of math. You got to divide that down into miles, but with a little bit of math, that's how you do it. So, pretty ingenious, right?
They didn't have an iPhone?
Yes, the Generation 1 debuted, sadly, July 1853, a month after they left. Thanks again for coming, guys. It really made my night, so.